Welcome back, everyone, for the Summarising Plenary session. Overlooking and the outcome of all sessions at ICEF2022 shall now commence. First, I would like to introduce the moderator for the session, Mr. Tanaka Nobuo, a chair of ICEF Steering Committee and former executive director of the International Energy Agency. And now I would like to ask Mr. Tanaka to moderate the session. So, Mr. Tanaka, if you please.
Okay, thank you very much. This session is about the whole summary of all the sessions, and we ask the moderators or chairs to come to the podium. So my question is just ask, what is your take from your session, basically? I was moderating the first policy session as well as nuclear session, so I will start myself. That my take of the first policy session is that geopolitics and energy crisis and energy transformation, all these things happen together, and we have to think about the policy in a very, very complicated manner. So the single, let's say, the past, we have the so-called open and free energy market. But now what is happening is a great competition by the great powers. So in this context, there are many discussions about we need a new industrial policy about deploying the renewable energy, electric vehicle, CCS, hydrogen, nuclear, everything. We need government's intervention to get and respond to the challenge of the competition. Well, this has a risk. How to standardize this rule for the new era, and who will be the losers, who will be the winners? And this is a really challenging subject. EU, in a way, is leading thanks to the war in Ukraine, and they have to move fast enough to away from Russian gas by using renewables, hydrogen, and nuclear. So can we match this speed of transformation? The other countries are agonizing to match the challenge. The US is using Inflation Reduction Act. Japan, who knows? I asked the question in the nuclear session. Possibly Japan can cope if Japan can really take care of the nuclear future here. Without proper way, sustainable nuclear, we cannot really be a winner. Sustainable nuclear, let's say, we have 4 conditions. I originally said 3 conditions, but Richard Lester added 1 more condition. So small modular, risk minimizing, or passive safe features. That is the one. The second is high-level radioactive waste management is the second condition. The third is the weapon. The proliferation resistance is the third condition. And the fourth is the socio-political context, or socio-political sustainability. And dialogue with local community to design the small modular reactor is one of the ways that this design justice can be achieved in the nuclear sector. Okay, this is a take for me in the nuclear and policy session. Let's move to John. What is your take?
Thank you, Tanaka-san. And yeah, mine was around energy transition, leaving nobody behind. And there were really 5 key areas we touched on, sort of balancing decarbonization and growth, balancing decarbonization and certain sectors that may be impacted by the transition, employment in those, decarbonization and different social strata, particularly the lower social echelon, between countries, developed and developing, and also the role of finance. So those were the sort of 5 key topics. And in terms of takeaways, on the growth side, I think that one message was that actually in some ways there is no trade-off of growth and decarbonization, because in order to have sustainable growth, you really need it to be green. You need to be in the industries that have a long-term growth, so that actually there may be some sort of micro trade-offs, but in the long run, your industrial strategy should be around growth and sustainable growth, and therefore in clean technologies, and therefore there really wasn't a trade-off. So that seemed to be the message around growth, particularly for high growth economies. In terms of sectors, there was really a need, I think, for sort of joined up thinking, and that was really the key message that came across. So really industrial strategy that includes jobs, includes skills, so that is not so siloed into different industries, that has good governance across these different areas, that connects national as well as regional policy and involves private and government firms. So again, a sort of highly collaborative but also joined up plan was seen as the way to make sure that there were all areas were included. And in terms of the social levels, again, the message there was around being people-centric and around connecting across different groups. So again, around having a dialogue, understanding the different groups, and generating a collective consensus. So I think, a little bit similar in terms of across different socio-economic groups, making sure they're engaged in the dialogue, that they're part of solving the problem, and not sort of excluded kind of thing. And then the last two, between developed and developing, the feeling was that maybe more things would be done in terms of climate clubs or bilateral agreements. The sort of, one global consensus was unlikely. And actually, as Tanaka-san said, working out the sort of new connections, if you like. So again, the feeling was, so long as there's dialogue and inclusion and engagement, then you have a chance of it being perceived, the transition to being perceived and actually being fairer, let's say. And that includes things like co-development, involvement of development banks and those kinds of things. So again, at an international level, making sure there is specific dialogue between different countries and different regions. And then finally on finance, we didn't talk a lot about that, but the general feeling was finance is on board. But there's a sort of lack of knowledge. There needs to be a lot of capacity building, a lot of skills building in order to really, so finance can be a sort of active partner in the transition. So I think those were the sort of 5 different conclusions, if you like, from our session.
Thank you, John. Yamaji Sensei.
Oh, okay. Let me report the summary of technical session 1. Actually, Professor Reiko Kuroda moderated the session, but unfortunately, her time is not available now. So I will report the summary of that session. And I moderated the discussion part of the session as a co-moderator. Okay, the theme of the technical session 1 is a demand-driven energy transformation. From steering committee members, Professor Nakchenovich joined as a panelist, in addition to Professor Kuroda and me. And there are 5 panelists, including Professor Nakchenovich. Among 5, 3 are ladies, including 1 young lady. So I think our session is a good gender and generation balance realized. The session discussed innovations in demand-side innovations in demand-side to transform energy systems. So what is the take? Okay. Innovations in demand-side include not only technologies, but also many social innovations, such as behavioral change, city design, or sharing and circular economy, and so on, to promote more efficient energy systems, or energy, also material efficiencies. And the second part is Okay, well, this is one of the technological innovations, digital transformation. Digital transformation also enables many energy demand transformations, such as the realization of prompt electric demand flexibility to accept massive introduction of variable renewable powers, such as photovoltaics and wind power. And also digital innovation, digital transformation realize the visualization of supply chain data related to emission, and I mean some scope 3 emission data. Thus promote industries' greenhouse gas emission reductions. There are many others. For example, some collective knowledge, common knowledge among the community or among the society is very important to support the demand side innovation to transform energy systems. But anyway, quite active and interesting presentations and discussions were made in the session. I think technical session 1 successfully proceeded. So that's a brief summary of that.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, George.
Thank you very much. What I take away from the session, heat and transportation, I think the road to net zero may perhaps be longer and harder to achieve than assumed in our scientific models. Why I'm so pessimistic? We are actually in a situation which had never been better for innovations in this field of heat and transportation. People, the population in many countries is aware about the problem of the climate crisis. They have suffered this year. We have very high prices on the energy market, so it may even be the question whether our new energy types of e-fuels, for example, or hydrogen may be cheaper if we have a good source of fuel, renewable fuel, than conventional fuels. And there is this issue of security of supply, which is, of course, an incentive. So, and if you look into our session, we have seen remarkable results of companies developing new technologies. In particular, Ruben Furi, he explained that a modular electrolyzer, which he is developing, may become a very important element of a transition to a e-fuel society or a net zero society. So the activities which are going on are really promising. So why I am pessimistic? The discussion in our session showed that the major bottleneck actually is regulation of the government. The regulation of the government doesn't follow the needs of new technologies. There is, of course, you need to adjust, the regulator must adjust incentives, for example, concerning greenhouse gas reduction credits or market designs. So, and this takes time, a lot of negotiation, a lot of time until this kind of market design changes or regulatory changes are in fact happening. So, but this is not the only thing what is remarkable. The more important is that many countries try to sponsor fossil energy consumption now in order to protect companies and households for high energy prices. For example, Germany has just announced to sponsor up to 200 billion euros in an interval of 3 years for that purpose. And of course, this kind of activities are really against the idea of promoting a transformation of the energy system towards net zero. So I think this is the reason why we must be careful, and of course, the claim of ICEF should be that the government should really take more attention to focus politics on energy transformation when they make decisions.
Thank you. David.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. Our session was on carbon dioxide removal, and I have 5 takeaways from that session. The first takeaway is very simple. Carbon dioxide removal is essential for meeting our climate change goals. The IPCC is very clear on that. I think the estimate that the IPCC offered in the 1.5 degree report is that we will need 100 to 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal, even if we can dramatically decarbonize our energy systems and other systems. So takeaway number 1 that I think all the panelists and speakers agreed on was carbon dioxide removal is essential. Second, there's lots of technological innovation happening in this space. It's a very exciting time. There's new sorbent and solvent technologies with direct air capture. There's new ways of using carbon mineralization that are very interesting. Actually, in an entirely separate session, we had a very interesting discussion of blue carbon and using the oceans for carbon removal. So there's a lot in a lot of different spaces that's happening here. The third takeaway was that the carbon dioxide removal industry is growing fast. And it's very interesting presentations about the number of companies that are now in this space and the way that facilities are scaling up. The first real carbon dioxide removal facility was built in Iceland and opened less than a year ago. I think it's removing about 4,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide. Same company is building a 40,000 ton a year removal site, and another company has plans for one that's 400,000 or 500,000 tons a year. So there's big scale up in this industry happening right now. It's still much smaller than is needed to solve the problem, but there's a lot of scale up happening. A fourth takeaway is that developing countries must have a stake in this, but at this point it's uncertain exactly how that's going to work. Maybe there are ways that developing countries can get paid for this, for participating in carbon dioxide removal, but those mechanisms are not there. Ismail Sergeldin made very good points around agriculture related to this, and I think this is a topic that requires a lot more discussion. And a fifth point that we talked a lot about were political and public acceptance challenges related to this issue. And I related an experience I had where I encountered some protesters who were calling for, they were shouting, climate action now, climate action now. And one of the protesters was shouting, no carbon capture, no carbon capture. And I was thinking, how can you contradict yourself in this way? But there's a group of climate activists who were actually opposed to carbon capture for some reasons that we spoke about in this session. And I think there's a big political challenge around public acceptance for this very important issue for the clean energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next is Chanwa.
Yeah, thank you, Tanaka-san. Our session just concluded, and I believe actually your memory is still fresh, and the 3 moderators are still sitting on the stage at this moment. So I didn't really talk to David or Wiley about the takeaways, so I'm going to do it whatever, since I'm, tasked to speak here. We talked a lot about the security risks of the sector and a lot of innovations, efforts on the ground. But in the end, I don't think we really today, at this moment, we really have the magic to address the issues there, particularly putting the challenge in the timeline 80 years, right? So there's a big concern, at least on my part. So if we do not have major breakthroughs actually of the risks, barriers actually still standing in the way, I doubt it very much we'll be able to deliver the goals by 2030. So that's a sort of the context there. So 5 takeaways. The first one is really around the relationship between geopolitics and energy transition. I think this particular sector, the critical minerals and metals, probably is a typical reflection of the sort of entangled relationship between the two factors there. I think yesterday at the plenary session, that was a sort of issues brought up, debated already. Today, we also sort of dived into a little debate. The answer is, I think we're talking about winners, losers. In this context, if we do not break this sort of deadlock of geopolitical rivalry or vicious, sort of even war, we're all gonna lose. No one will win. I think it's as simple as that. And that's how critical that is. That is why actually globally we have to figure out how to address this, particularly for the leaders of major economies. They all need to take on their responsibility. What's happening now around the world, the war, the US-China geopolitical rivalry there is not really helpful. It doesn't help at all. That's really irresponsible. So that's the first takeaway. The second takeaway actually is around the ESG or sustainability. The sector overall, as we listened through the presentations, the speakers actually, a lot of efforts in terms of innovation, right? On the environmental side, on the societal side. But generally speaking, many issues are not addressed yet. So we simply say there are still a lot of ESG challenges there. I think Vali mentioned actually the indigenous people issue, right? The rights to the land issue there. So we have a lot of legacy issues there on the society part, right? There's a cultural heritage issues there, damages there, liability there, compensation, whatever. So we have, the sector has issues like that. In the meantime, on the environmental side, right? And the mining sector consumes energy, it damages the fresh water, biodiversity, you name it, right? So that's still a challenge that the sector needs to address collectively. The third takeaway is really the value chain perspective. I think, particularly from an arena perspective, as an international organization, so it's a sort of this platform partnership by convening key players along the value chain, trying to really say collectively, let's deep dive into certain issues, let's collectively innovate to find solutions on certain things. So hopefully, somehow through that process, we'll be able to collectively address some of the major challenges there. The fourth takeaway is really around the innovation. I think technology, policy, we talked about many innovations there, but standardization is key. And the standards needs to be set collectively by players actually in both the developed and developing countries at this moment, and that part needs to happen as well. The final takeaway is really about the younger generation, the talents and the workforces there. I think we heard from our younger generation representative there, this sector overall is not that attractive. On one side, we know how critically important actually the sector is for the sustainable or clean energy future. But in the meantime, this reputation risk, whatever, all the things actually is not attractive to the young talents at all. That's a huge risk, right? If without talents, without workforces, there's no way we're going to address that. So I think one at the end, this again from the younger generation, I think it's a sort of slogan type, saying no minerals, actually no clean energy transition. I think that's probably the message already imprinted on the mind of all of us. Hopefully that will add the level of urgency for all of us, so that we'll be able to really going back to the reality, figure out drive solutions or innovations and really trying to break all the deadlocks we are facing today. Thank you.
Thank you. Vali.
Thank you very much. I'll just make a few general comments. I want to make 4 comments about what stuck with me. In no order of priority. The first is I was struck by the phenomenal advances that are being made in carbon capture. I must say that I was pleasantly surprised at the work that is going on there. The second is that I was struck by the innovation and the money and R&D that's being put into climate-friendly and safe nuclear energy. I was really struck by the work that's being done there, and I thought not many people are aware. We got a good global picture of that. The third is the presence of the young people made me think that perhaps those of us in the climate change movement, maybe it's becoming aged, a little bit aged. And I do hope that young people will become more assertive. in the climate change movement. And the fourth is about the question of the geopolitical tension. What we have seen in Ukraine, with the Ukraine war, is the first thing that the participants in the war do is they abandon all multilateral agreements. They don't apply anymore. And, you know, in Southern Africa, we have a saying which says that when two elephants fight, the ground suffers. And so we have the big danger of China and the United States sparring for a fight. That's what it looks like from where I come from. We look far away. And if they do end up fighting, we are all going to suffer. Of course, today we're talking about climate change. It will be a huge setback to climate change. Because climate change, like nothing else, is a global phenomenon, a truly global phenomenon that can only be dealt with through a global strategy and multilateral agreements. And all of the work that we've done since 1992 has been aimed at a multilateral agreed approach to climate change, and we've made huge advances as the world. And with more war, this is something that's going to be abandoned, and we should be very worried about it. So in the past 2 days, Chair, this is one thing that has come up quite a lot. We've seen North Korea firing missiles across Japan for reasons that I don't know why they're doing that. And then you've got maybe provoking or maybe asserting themselves, but it can only be bad. There can be nothing good about such a thing happening. And so this is something that we should really be terribly worried about. It's come up right from the beginning when the head of the International Energy Agency described to us why currently we are in the biggest energy crisis the world has ever faced. I didn't think about it in that sort of way. It came up in the discussion on the supply of metals and minerals. It came up in the discussion on nuclear energy, and it came up in the discussion whenever there was a mention about gas as a possible transition fuel, this matter came up. So it is a huge danger that faces us, and I do hope that the COP in Egypt, because that's where the governments will all be, one of the things they need to say to themselves is that conditions of peace are essential for continued advance towards a net zero 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, Vali. It's a very relevant statement. I think I want to ask the same question. I mean, to Ismail. Ismail, I think you're supposed to be on the podium, but unfortunately not. Can you make some comments, Ismail, from there? And also Naki. I think Naki is just sitting and smiling over there. He has to contribute also.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, we had a very interesting side session, and as David mentioned, there was the issue primarily of the food and agriculture sector, which has to reach out. We have already over 800 million people who are going hungry, and according to Beasley, who's the head of the World Food Program, another 49 million are on the verge of starvation in 43 countries right now. And the situation is not getting well. But from our perspective, not only that, the entire sector needs to be transformed because it is already contributing 33% of the total emissions and greenhouse gas equivalent. And as a result, that's a huge amount. And on top of that, part of it is due to deforestation, part of it is due to bad agricultural practices, part of it is due to fertilizer, part of it is due to a lot of other things. But on top of that, it's a sector that also has, believe it or not, 30% wastage, but 15% on the smallholder production side, where we lose as much as 35% of the post-harvest losses, And on the consumer side, about another 15% of the food is wasted, thrown away. So, I mean, you have a huge amount of waste and a huge contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And specifically, it can do a lot with the new technologies such as genetic engineering and genetic genome editing and so on. We can have trees that will grow, not only will grow fast in reforestation, but also absorb a lot more CO2. I mean, in many ways, this is nature's primary CO2 removal machinery that we're talking about. But we need to arrange it in a way so that it really becomes much more efficient, much more effective, and much more useful. It will also be a primary means of redressing the historic imbalances between the rich and the poor, because a lot of what we're talking about will be the smallholder farmers in Asia and Africa and Latin America. So we had proposals on that, and we looked at that, and I think that this is something, as David said, that deserves more attention in ICEF in the future. It is, as I say, nature's primary machinery for absorbing CO2.
Thank you, Ismail. Naki.
Thanks for the opportunity of saying a few words. I was quite impressed of the proceedings of the last 2 days. I have to say, you know, I share also what Ismail has just said, the view, you know, we are facing multiple crises. The question is, how are we going to recover from that? And net zero challenge that the humanity has been working on for at least 30 years, I would say even longer, but certainly for the last 30 years, I think is being threatened by these multiple crises. So the question is, at least for me, how can we embark on the transformational agenda that should be the objective of the humanity to achieve safe and just future for all of us? And I think all of the sessions have addressed that question. For me, at least from our session that Kenji summarized, there is also another important message, and that is that we have to improve the efficiency of how we use the resources in order to make peace with the nature, let me put it that way. And so I think that the demand efficiency, whether it's food or energy, those are the two key areas, is very important, as well as the options and the system transformations toward efficiency and how we can reduce the waste. So I share very much this sentiment of the meeting, and I really hope that the discussions here, and in particular from the panel, can lead us into the next ICEF, where we will see some solutions.
Yeah.
I think it's time now to try to use this crisis as an opportunity for a new start, because otherwise I think the humanity will lose the great achievements since the Industrial Revolution and certainly over the last few decades of the Great Expansion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Naki. As you say, that we have to think about what we are going to do next year, 2023. Steering committee will meet in Paris in March, and discuss it. But you know, current discussion leads us to the several, let's say, topics for the future. And I want to ask again for the whole, you know, steering committee members, what do you think is important for next year? What we have to do next year in a different area, or deepen and more concrete action agenda for certain the issues which we have discussed this year? Just give us your, let's say, assessment and what we have to do next year. From my side, as a policy innovation sector, as well as nuclear, maybe in the policy, when this geopolitics and industrial policy is very important elements, we don't know what will happen to Russia and Ukraine, so it's very difficult to predict what we will discuss next year. But Chanwa contributed a lot from Chinese perspective, and discussion between Megan O'Sullivan and Chanwa is so interesting. So I want to focus more about policy related issues with China. How can we accommodate Chinese innovation or transformation to the global sense? How can we accommodate, or can we just leave it to the United States and China for their bilateral discussion, or we have to take up this very difficult, challenging geopolitical issue of US-China issues here to discuss the perspective of our policy challenge or policy innovation, diplomatic policy, strategic, geopolitical policy innovation. That is my first idea. The second, for the nuclear, I am really fed up with detailed nuclear technologies. All the experts, I'm not engineering background, many scientists and nuclear experts tell me, this is the best, the world #1 technology, let's do it. And I cannot judge which one is the best. So next year, I want to talk about more commercial fusion. Fusion may leapfrog the fission reactors, because there are many commercial fusion projects moving around the world, and lots of venture capitalists put their money into it, because we don't know which one will succeed. There are many Japanese, Americans, and even UK. There are lots of different ideas or similar ones. ITER is a global standard, but ITER is very big, bureaucratic, international collaboration, and yes, it's a benchmark, but if one of the commercial fusions succeed, it's a breakthrough, and it's a revolution in the energy sector. Who knows which one will succeed? So maybe I am more interested in discussing fusion, replacing the future of the nuclear power as a subject. John, what is your idea?
I have three different thoughts. One is around, as Vali said, it was great to have some younger voices and brains this year. I would quite like to have them ask the questions rather than be asked questions, because I think they would ask more direct, more pointed questions, and also help on the sort of communications and engagement side. So they are sort of much more wired in ways that many of us are not. So again, the communication piece, I think we could get a lot of help on. So I think sort of,
You mean to get more youth through the communication from ICEF?
Yeah, how to communicate out to the wired communities, as I say, sort of, because they're sort of more engaged in that. So I suppose using youth more wisely. The second thought was around obviously inclusion and having broader groups and a dialogue. So one thought is around not just having a dialogue once a year. And trying to get the right people in one place in one instance, is there could be dialogues that are actually ongoing that draw people in who are the right mix. They're hard to find in one go, but you could evolve those groups. So you could have some sort of dialogue groups.
Continuous dialogue.
Continuous, which can still meet here, but in between our sessions, it would allow us to involve a sort of more weird and wonderful group of people, collaboratively.
Interesting idea.
And my third idea is around something we as a business have thought a lot about, is this idea of a framework in order to execute. The problem we have is complexity, and what happens is we end up finding the next sort of challenge and the next complex thing to think about. In terms of actual execution, we have this Pathfinder framework, which was done for policymakers, which was about saying this group of technologies is ready to roll, don't even think about it, pour money in, execute now. There are a set of other technologies, unproven, you got to do R&D. You don't need the whole plan in order to execute. So a way of breaking down the plan into 4 groupings. The third grouping was about transition off carbon-intensive industries, which again is different from the first 2. And the final one was around standards, which was mentioned just earlier. all of those things can operate completely separately, including pillar one, which is, roll them out. There's no reason why, electric vehicles aren't kind of everywhere quicker than we thought. I know there are some bottlenecks, but let's then focus on those bottlenecks and roll that out ASAP. So again, thinking about a framework for execution. It's different from what we normally talk about, but it's a methodology and somewhere that I think would be a good place to then hang our different technology ideas.
Thank you. Yamaji-sensei.
Okay, so very stimulating talk by Tanaka-san. There are many points I'd like to respond, but taking a few. The first is the nuclear issue. Okay. You mentioned nuclear fusion technologies, but we have already developed nuclear fusion technology around 70 years, to my understanding. So it is not, for me, not so fruitful to talk about future of nuclear fusion technologies, because that is a very, how to say, there is some critical mass. Nuclear fusion needs a big device. It is not a granular. So I think this is okay. I'm not so completely denying the future of nuclear fusion, but it is not so interesting to me. That is my point.
I am very interested in Yamaji-sensei. You are two experts in this field, I guess.
Yeah, and the second point I'd like to say is you mentioned some policy issues we have already taken, but you mentioned about politics or geopolitics. I think it's very interesting. Probably we are very much stimulated by the discussion about geopolitics. But from the field of academia, that issue is interesting, but there will be no solution.
Okay.
So I'm afraid the outcome of the discussion on geopolitics. And the last point I like to pick up is that is non-energy and non-climate change technology is important going to be, to my understanding. I said social innovation is very important for the demand-driven energy transformation. And social innovation is not done by technologies, including software technologies. Such technologies are not a specified technology for energy field or climate change, such as an Internet of Things, blockchain, sensor network. Such kind of technology support social innovations. So how about to take such kind of non-energy and non-climate change technologies to contribute to the climate change solution?
Yes, definitely. I think digital transformation is typical one for contributing to the climate change mitigation. Thank you very much, Yamaji-sensei. Yes, George.
Yeah, thank you. I think from the beginning of ICEF, it was always hydrogen, a very central technology, and maybe we should continue to discuss hydrogen issues, and maybe in the future more in the way how we did this year, namely show examples where hydrogen technology becomes affordable, cheap, etc. So maybe there are a lot of startups which began to develop hydrogen. And now some of these startups, of course, went bankrupt, but some survived. And if we could show these startups what they did, how they will proceed, I think this is a very good idea. And this brings me to the second element. These startups typically are managed by young people. The young people are not good for our association, for our ICEF, because these people are young. No, they are good because they are motivated and have the capacity and the energy to bring things forward. And we have seen at this meeting very well how these young people are engaged in bringing things forward. And I think we should also think about bringing these young people, or some of them, into a steering committee to have them in a discussion. I think that there should be our radar to find where are actual trends. This is, I think, to my view, what can be done in the future. Okay. And hopefully then we will have maybe in some sessions even more than one representative from the young generation.
Yeah, good point. George, thank you very much. By the way, as German, you don't like the idea of developing the sustainable nuclear for Germany?
Yeah, of course, Germany is a very complicated country.
I know.
For historical reasons and for present reasons. Actually, the minister in charge for nuclear is from the Green Party. And the Green Party was founded 30 years ago for two purposes. One is peace party, they wanted to make peace, and the second purpose was get rid of nuclear. It's not really green, it was get rid of nuclear. If the anti-nuclear movement would be like in France, so irrelevant, we would have not the green minister for economics. So this is very special. And now ask the minister for nuclear, which comes from the green, to do something in favor of nuclear. It's really something. Maybe there are things which are easier.
But for Green Party, sustainable nuclear may, hit the change in the policy. But anyway, well,
I laugh a little bit.
I mean, we will continue forever the discussion.
I laugh a little bit. Sustainable, yes, but change the word nuclear.
Maybe atomic policy, atomic energy. How about that? Okay, let's move to David.
I admire your optimism, Tanaka-san. I think sustainable nuclear for the Green Party is like dry water or something like this. I think. But I have one process suggestion and three substance suggestions. My process suggestion is we need a social media presence vastly beyond what we have. And this relates to the discussion we're having about young people. I think one thing we could do is have them not just speak on stage, but help us with the social media presence, which is an amplifier of everything that goes on. And without it, we're just not in the dialogue, I think. And so one goal I would recommend is by next year that we have an active Twitter presence, an active Instagram presence, an active TikTok presence. And I'm not an expert at these things, but we need people who are to really make that happen. So that's my process suggestion. Okay. And then three topics that I think we could talk about. One is artificial intelligence in the energy transition. There's so much happening in this space, it's remarkable. There's this open source website I went to recently where you can talk to a computer and ask it questions. And I asked it 4 questions, and for 2 of the answers, it was indistinguishable from what a person would have said. It met that Turing test. And this is going to have a big implication for energy, and so I think that's an important topic. The second is vehicle grid integration. Extremely important as we scale up electric vehicles all over the world. There's an enormous amount happening in that space. And then the third is what is the food system, and what Ismail was saying. I think that would be a really important topic to focus on for next year.
Thank you. Changhua.
Yes. With all the great ideas already on the table, I'm going to try to maybe drive 4 potential content-oriented things. The first one actually on geopolitics there. I'm thinking loud actually back before Copenhagen, before 2009. So professionally, I was working at the climate group, working with Tony Blair, trying to break the deadlock. So that's sort of, in order to have a successful Copenhagen process, of course, it sort of collapsed. We didn't really make it. But somehow, while sitting here talking about the geopolitics, just suddenly occurred to me, maybe we could do something like that, actually, called Breaking the Deadlock, right? And that's specific, more like a second track or something like that. Rather than being stuck in the US-China situation, I think we do need to take one step back, really look in the shared human destiny, on this planet, and then probably we could somehow figure out through some conversations we could help, if not totally address that, but somehow helpful to a certain extent. The second point, actually, I think the minerals, the supply chain security of critical minerals and metals need to be repeated, not exactly the same, but the content, I think this is the first year, I think it's critical enough, actually, significant enough to be carried on next year. So we could further design. Now we have 3 moderators here, so we can continue to work together. We can welcome others there as well. The third one is really around the nexus. I think, this is about energy. We have food. Actually, part of my professional life, I'm dedicated to water security. So I have not heard about it, about water. Water is critical, right? And then plus ecosystem. There is a background, and now we do have the Paris Agreement, and before the end of the year, we're going to have the new Convention of Biological Diversity, so CBD, another convention. So globally, we're going to be driven by, on one side of the carbon, the other part is nature, and that's going to impact everything, including the minerals, stuff right there as well. So I'm thinking loud in a way, maybe this nexus issue, we need to integrate to look at all those issues, besides the technology, stuff like that. The last one is more like a system. I know technologies are important, but most of the technologies are deployed in systems, right? In China, we call it modern power system, right? The thinking is pretty much looking at, the power sector, upstream, downstream, the ecosystem, whatever. I think that sort of systemic thinking probably will be also helpful for us to look into next year. Yes, it's still innovation, but not just technology, or even technology policy, but somehow more holistically. So those are the 4 thoughts added to, on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Vali.
Chairman, a lot has been said already. Hello? It's working. There's only 2 things, 2 points I'd like to make, is that it may be an idea, we can't do everything, of course, but it may be an idea for us to try to see whether we can get some presentations on the innovation that is taking place in China and in India. I have no doubt that the institutions there, there's phenomenal institutional capacity in both those countries, and I think it would be good for us to get some ideas to what is the thinking there.
Thank you. Ismail, and then Naki.
Thank you. I do suggest there's one thing which sort of permeates everything. I think the web of life is very strongly connected with water. And we are not sufficiently looking at that side of it. There is, for example, a startling and scary statistic that 40% of the groundwater is being removed at rates that are totally unsustainable. In other words, the aquifers are drying out as we draw water from them much faster than the recharge rates. Secondly, we know that we're going to have much more erratic rainfall and cycles of drought and cycles of floods, which are devastating because actually also even from a food point of view, you can't grow stuff in the flood and you can't grow stuff in the drought. So you have very, very serious problems. On top of that, I was involved with a commission, with the Global Commission on Water right now, with Johan Rockström, who's been doing some work in this area. And he is saying that there is a profound disturbance happening in the hydrological cycle of the planet. And we know that there is a very strong correlation between water and the climate. So the hydrological cycle and the climate cycle are having major interactions, but these interactions are now being disturbed severely between the blue water and the green water in the hydrological cycle. So what does that say in terms of what the prospects are for what we are trying to do from dealing with the emissions side without looking at what's happening with the water, because the water content, of course, has a major impact on the rainfall and on many other things. So I think that this is a topic which we haven't yet tackled. And also, I understand that there are some significant efforts right now being done in a number of countries, both in terms of dealing with how to get more fresh water, but also with how to, in fact, affect this imbalance in the hydrological cycle. And that may be a topic worthy of our concern.
Thank you, Ismail. I think we have already 2 votes for the water. Maybe water is a very good subject to talk about next year. Well, let's go to Naki.
Thank you. The advantage of being the last is that it has been all said before, so I can just amplify some of the ideas that resonate really strongly with me. Number one, I think that almost everybody agreed on is, I think, the next generation, the early career colleagues need to be involved in a more fundamental way. I think it was already a great progress in this to have one early career person on most of the panels, but I would imagine that we can enrich that program to have special sessions, maybe also some of the concluding statements coming from the next generation. So I think those of us, who have come into the years, we can worry about the next 10 years, but they have to worry about the next 50 years. And I think David's suggestion is also very good, that I think we could involve that generation in helping us with the digital revolution, social media, and making this event present in the other channels. So I think that's number one. Number two, I would say is actually a little bit, my suggestion would be to focus a little bit more next time exactly like this panel is. I mean, I think this panel was great because it provided more of a systemic view of what are the challenges ahead of us and the opportunities. So, you know, I think it's great. It was very good to have the sessions on various topics, but I think, let's call them silos just to make a point. But I think it would be good to have an integrative session, perhaps even at the beginning like this one. I strongly support the idea, you know, in that session addressing the question of the nexus, but I would also go beyond and look at the systems. And then the third point I would like to make, since this is about the innovation, it would be nice that we try to address more explicitly. I think we had that already 3 years ago in the last in-person meeting, more explicitly both technological and let's call them human innovations. I would call it positive tipping, because we are in such a situation, I think, worldwide, that radical change would be required over the next decades to really get humanity on the right track. And I think that returning to that agenda even stronger would be important. Not just look at the technologies themselves, not only look at the human behavior, but in an integrated way. I think that would be very important. And then maybe as a side remark, in addition to these 3 points, we should also consider what ICEF started, I think more or less from the beginning, the innovation awards, both social and technological, and hopefully also more integrated ones. So I think maybe we should consider that if there are resources to do that. I thought that was very useful because also it gives generates new ideas, what could be done, because I think one of the great results of this meeting is that many of you have said is impressive progress in technological area, whether it's carbon capture and storage, whether it's carbon removal, nuclear technologies, and in particular renewables. They have gone down a lot, but also end-use technologies like heat pumps and electric vehicles. So I think it would be really nice to re-enter that agenda of what progress has been made also in terms of awards.
Thank you. You have just exhausted all the time allocated to us. Just 11 seconds more. So thank you very much for the contribution and your assessment of this year's ICEF sessions. And I think we can give the Secretariat as well as the audience that what we are going to discuss next year or from now. I mean, engaging young people more is definitely a must, and very important elements of ICEF for the future. But there are many issues. We don't know what will happen to the geopolitical changes from now, what will be the COVID situation next year. We have to still think flexibly what will be the next year's agenda. But I think this kind of discussion, this is the first time we have organized this moderator or chaired session, but I think it is a very interesting exercise and will continue. Thank you very much.